Hi everyone, my name is Avi. I'm here to talk about model-based architecture diagramming. In the course of my career, I've spent a lot of time documenting systems for internal audiences. Audiences such as the people designing, building, and operating those systems, or executives who want to make plans for and investments in those systems, or new hires. Over time, I've come to think of this work as being about answering this question: what is there even? Which often morphs into, what the F is there even? In other words, what systems do we have and how do they relate to each other? It turns out answering this question can be comically difficult. If you're in an org that's moved fast and punted on documentation, you might be familiar with this. Or maybe an org that has grown via acquisitions and none of the systems were ever integrated in a coherent way. Or maybe there are 3 or 4 offices spread around the world, each with its own view of the systems. Whatever the scenario, it turns out answering this question, what systems do we have and how do they relate to each other, it can be just absurdly difficult, which is one reason it often turns into, what the F is there even? Just as an aside, when you do finally answer it, the next question is often, why? Or more likely, why the F? As in, why the F do we have so many systems? And why the F is every system connected to every other system? I have many feelings about this, but that's a whole different talk. Anyway, so back to this question. What systems do we have and how do they relate to each other? This is fundamentally a question about software architecture. And I've found over the years that software architecture questions can often be answered by software architecture diagrams. Anyway, so back to this question. What systems do we have and how do they relate to each other? This is fundamentally a question about software architecture. And I've found over the years that software architecture diagrams can be a great way to answer software architecture questions. Now I know that when I mention software architecture diagrams, some of you have queasy flashbacks to that time you were new at an org, and someone drew an incoherent stream of consciousness mess on a whiteboard. Something like this: a confused mess of boxes and lines that was somehow supposed to enlighten you, but just left you with a tangled mess in your head. I relate, I've been there. I took this photo during just such a session. And that's why I said that software architecture diagrams can be a great way to answer software architecture questions. But really, architecture diagrams really can be great. And when they really are a powerful and effective way to communicate and learn the architecture of a system. That said, even when one of us does manage to create a great software architecture diagram, the way we create those diagrams leaves a lot to be desired. Now, I've been doing this kind of work for a long time, so I could probably whine for hours about the many flaws in the tools and techniques that we use for diagramming. But that wouldn't be helpful to anyone. I mean, it might be cathartic for me, but there's a time and a place for everything. So instead of whining about all the flaws, I'd like to focus my whining on one flaw. A flaw that I'm starting to think might in fact be a fundamental flaw in how we practice software architecture diagramming. That flaw is an example of something I've come to see as common in our young field: combining two things. Combining two things that really, fundamentally don't need to be combined, and perhaps shouldn't be. Kind of like mobile phones and beard trimmers. Well, maybe not really like mobile phones and beard trimmers, but I thought it was a funny picture. So in the case of software architecture diagrams, those two things that maybe don't really need to be combined are modeling and illustrating. See, when we create these diagrams, most of the time we aren't working from an existing model, at least not a formal model, nothing beyond the fuzzy model in our heads, which makes sense. In our field, such models, formal models, are rare. So we do what we must. We pick up our markers or open OmniGraffle or Visio and just start figuring it out on the fly. And when we do, by necessity, we are simultaneously discovering and confirming what relevant elements exist, why they're relevant, and how they relate to each other, and on the other hand, devising a visual representation of those elements and relationships that affects learning. Now, I know those two ideas were really, really catchy and you've already memorized them, but just humor me for a second, let's review them. Discovering and confirming what relevant elements exist, why they're relevant, and how they relate to each other. To me, that's awfully close to modeling. So let's talk about modeling. I checked the Oxford English Dictionary, and the most relevant definition seemed to be the devising or use of abstract or mathematical models, which is helpful, I guess, but what exactly is a model? So here's the relevant definition of model from the Oxford English Dictionary. A simplified description of a system or process to assist calculations and predictions. Which seems pretty good, but if I had written it, I would have included analysis. So, a description of a system or process to assist calculations, predictions, Oxford comma, and analysis. So we'll come back to modeling, but now let's talk about illustrating. I said a few minutes ago that the other thing we're doing simultaneously with modeling when we're working on a diagram is devising a visual representation of those elements and relationships that affects learning. And, it might be reasonable to call that more or less illustrating. I mean, it's illustrating for the purposes of learning. It's not doodling, but it's illustrating, I think. Now bear with me, there's one more bit of semantic analysis to do, and then we'll move on to some more concrete analysis. I just want to try to boil these down a little bit. I use these phrases to identify the activities typically involved in software architecture diagramming. But if we remove the verbs, something interesting happens. It becomes clearer that, well, the goal of that top activity, that's content. And the goal of that bottom activity, that's presentation. When I realized this, it felt like a good sign, like I was onto something. After all, the separation of content and presentation has been considered a very good idea for a very long time. This goes back at least as far as a presentation delivered in 1967 by William Tunnicliffe. Ask me later about the rabbit hole that led me to that factoid. So, I have a modest proposal. We should apply the separation of content and presentation to software architecture diagrams. That's my proposal. I hope you'll consider it. Of course, I should probably give you some, reasons to consider it. So next, I'll talk for a bit about the how and the why. Well, we should start, though, with the why. Why should we separate the content from the presentation, the model from the visualization? What are the benefits to be gained? Here's some that I've thought of and that I've experienced to some degree. Collaboration. Separating the content and the presentation, the model and the illustration, or the visualization, can broaden the pool of people with whom we can collaborate. I found that people in software organizations are often uninterested or unable to collaborate on architecture diagrams, I think it's because the conventional way of authoring diagrams can be intimidating, overwhelming, or disconcerting. But when these concerns are separated, working with either is more accessible, less daunting. We can work with data people on the model and with visual creators on the visualizations. And this can also expand the group of people who can maintain the content over time. Consistency. So having a model that is discrete, that's separate from the visualizations, it enables us to generate multiple visualizations, diagrams, from a single model, and thereby ensure that the information in those diagrams is always in sync. When something changes, and things always change, you change it once in one place in the model, and the change then propagates to all relevant diagrams. Now, part of that is about tooling, but this is still a big benefit, right? I'm not saying any of this is free and easy, but this is sort of what's possible and why it's compelling. Focus. By separating the content and the presentation, the model and the visualization, we can work on one without being distracted by the other. This doesn't work for all people or at all times or even apply to all people, but when it does, it can make a big difference. Text. So separating the content from the presentation gives us the ability to express the model, maybe even the visualizations also, as text. And therefore, we can collaborate using text-oriented version control systems, change review tools, discussion tools, things like that, which means we can apply docs as code, this sort of a philosophy of using the same tools and workflows as we do for software itself to the documentation. We can apply that philosophy to the model, which it can be huge. Finally, data. Once the model is discrete, it can be just data. And if you reify it as data, you can express it as data, and therefore you can then that enables all sorts of things. For example, you can import data from elsewhere, from sort of upstream into the model. Or you can maybe export data from the model to somewhere else and use it for other purposes, or maybe read the model directly and just sort of use it as data for all sorts of purposes, because your model of your systems can also be thought of as a catalog of your systems, which can have all sorts of uses. So these are some of the reasons, I think that, the main reasons why I think we should apply the separation of content and presentation to software architecture diagrams. Next, how can we do this? I think there are two sides to this: tools and determination. So let's take a look at some tools first. These are a set of tools I recommend, those that strike me as the most promising as of today. I'd like to share a quick description of each one. First, and for me foremost, is the C4 model for visualizing software architecture. The C4 model is a meta model, so it's a model for creating models, and it defines a small set of abstractions and diagram types for diagramming software architecture. Since it's a meta model, it can be used with any tool or medium from a whiteboard to a supercomputer. Now, I don't have time to go into depth on it, but it has an excellent website. I recommend everyone check it out and at least read the 5-minute introduction or watch the 30-minute talk. The person who created the C4 model, Simon Brown, also created Structurizer. It's a collection of tooling to create software architecture diagrams and documentation based upon the C4 model. Structurizer is an excellent toolkit with a comprehensive feature set, multiple interfaces, a generous free tier, and solid documentation. I highly recommend that you all check it out and give it a try, especially the text-based modeling DSL. C4 Plant UML is a set of resources including macros, stereotypes, and other things like VS Code snippets for creating C4 diagrams with Plant UML. Now, I haven't used this, but it does look very well documented, which makes me, gives me confidence that it's a high-quality resource. But, note that it seems to be targeted at people who are already familiar with Plant UML. Maybe they're already using Plant UML. If that's not you, you might want to start with a different tool, such as C4 Builder. C4 Builder is a command line tool that builds on C4 Plant UML, and adds its own conventions, such as a specific project structure, and its own features, such as a rich set of export options. It seems like it could also be used as a static site builder, for example. I haven't used it, but again, the docs look really solid. Croki is a free, open-source web API that can render diagrams expressed in over a dozen different textual formats. You can download and run it yourself, or you can use the publicly available instance hosted at croki.io. I haven't used it much, but it looks really great. Solid docs, too. You may be detecting a theme here. I seem to be biased towards tools that have good docs, which is just shocking. Last but not least, dataset. Now, dataset has nothing to do with diagramming, but I wanted to share an example of something I mentioned earlier. One of the benefits of separating our content from our presentation is the ability to express our models as data, and therefore use the models as data for various purposes beyond diagrams. For example, dataset. It's a free and open source tool for publishing data as an interactive explorable website and web API. This is the dataset UI for browsing and querying data. So if we can figure out how to get our model into a SQLite database, the dataset gives us a browsable, queryable web UI and a web API that makes the data programmatically queryable. I don't know about you, but I love the idea of making this data available to both humans and machines in an org. I mean, imagine a shared queryable model of all of an org's systems, right? A sort of master catalog available for any person or any tool in the org to access at any time. This is something I've been working towards actually for a while now. I'm not quite there yet, and it's unclear if the universe wants this to happen, but I'm hoping to keep chipping away at it over time. Now, there are some tools that I can't quite recommend for various reasons, but I'm definitely not discouraging you from checking these out. In fact, if none of the tools I've recommended so far resonate with you or fulfill your requirements, I suggest you take a look at these. Now, these are some tools that I have to discourage you from using for software architecture diagramming. Basically, these are illustration tools. To varying degrees, they use proprietary or opaque data formats. They have no support for the semantics of architecture diagrams. They mix content and presentation. There's no way to base multiple diagrams on a single model, so they engender duplication and inconsistency. And it's either hard or impossible to diff two different versions of a diagram, which impedes the adoption of docs as code workflows. Finally, I've got a bonus tool to share. It's brand new, so it's unproven, but it might be useful. It's the Flax maturity model of software architecture diagramming. It's another model, and this time it's a model of an evolving practice. If you're interested in trying out some of the ideas and tools I'm discussing today, this model provides one possible path, a progression from where you might be now to a radically improved practice of software architecture diagramming. Level 0 is an implicit model and manual visualizations. So you're sort of manually creating the model and the visualizations at the same time in an illustration tool or on a whiteboard. This is the sort of the common, most sort of default approach. Level 1, a discrete model plus manual visualizations. So now you have a discrete model separate from the visualizations, but you're still manually creating the visualizations, probably with an illustration tool. Level 2, the model is now text, which means you can apply docs as code workflows to it. Level 3, the model is now data, so you can import into it, export from it, do all sorts of repurposing the data, use it for other purposes. And level 4, your model and your visuals are both data. And you can actually use tools to generate your diagrams from the model and the visuals. Now, I want to be clear, this is not a race. There's no winning or losing. There's no moral judgment associated with any of these levels. You know, we all have lots of competing priorities, and improving our practice of software architecture diagramming is just one of many. And I'm just sharing this model in the hopes that it might spark some thinking, some planning, some discussions. Oh yeah, determination. So just before we conclude, a few words about determination. I said a few minutes ago that tools and determination are the two sides of how we can apply the separation of content and presentation to software architecture diagramming. The tools side is, I think, pretty straightforward, but you might be wondering why I'm bringing up determination. Well, it's because if we do what I'm proposing, if we attempt to do what I'm proposing, there will be some friction. Conflating modeling and illustrating is so widespread, it's the norm. And there's all sorts of friction that comes from deviating from any norm. But just because a technique is widespread and dominant doesn't mean that it's a good idea. Just look at object-oriented programming. As documentarians, we often have to champion ideas and practices that we know are valuable, important, and just better. So if the ideas I've shared here resonate with you, if you find them compelling and you want to try them out, it's going to take a little determination. But stick with it, and I think it'll be worthwhile in the end. Okay, let's wrap up. I'll do a quick review first with some oversimplified takes. Software architecture diagrams, great medium for learning. The way we create and maintain them, not great. Why? Content and presentation are conflated. Huh? Well, the content is a model, the presentation is the visualization. What should we do? Deconflate them. How? With tools and determination. Remember, there's no I in team, but there's a you in people who apparently don't understand the relationship between orthography and meaning. Thank you, Randall Munro. I hope that some of you will give this a try. And perhaps we can form a little micro community around this, which I guess is these days is a Slack channel. Because if we work on this together, we'll be even more likely to succeed. That's it. Thank you for your time. A few quick thank yous. Thank you to Alicia for her wonderful talk, Draw the Docs, at last year's Portland conference. Thank you to Simon Brown for his work and generosity in creating and sharing the C4 model and structurizer, and for championing the value of modeling over diagramming. Finally, thank you to you. You've been a lovely audience. I mean, really, not a single interruption, not even the snoring I usually get. I'd love to hear you all think, so I look forward to your questions and comments in the Q&A. Also, if you can spare a few moments to answer just 2 short questions about this talk so I can make it better, I'd really appreciate it. You can use the QR code on the left, or if you're looking at the slides in a PDF form or something, you can just click that link at the bottom there. Finally, I'm on the job market right now, so if you know of any opportunities you want to send my way, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Hi. Hello. Hey, nice to see you.
Sorry I'm late. I got so hung up. I just got so hung up in like watching the chat. It was fun.
Oh, yeah, same here. I like the, is that not a finger painting? I see some footprints in that painting behind you.
A foot painting.
Awesome.
I have a 7-year-old, but I guess she was maybe 4 or something, 3 or 4 when she did that.
It's lovely. I think we're going to get a bunch of questions in the Q&A. So I'll just get started with some of the ones that we already had in the stage chat, and then also throw in some of my own. Colin had mentioned that he was curious about your take on architecture decision records and producing documentation from them. I don't know, did you happen to see his question in there in the stage chat?
I did, but I didn't. I wasn't really trying to think through the questions at the time. I was sort of letting them
absolutely
go past me. So I really like the ideas behind the ADR format, the architecture decision record format. I find that they are often misapplied, or sort of people start off applying them with the right ideas in mind, the right spirit, and then they sort of get off track. I'm not sure what exactly they have to do with diagramming, because diagramming is sort of, again, like trying to say it's modeling and it's visualization. There are tools that attempt to sort of be a sort of comprehensive documentation tool. right? So they're like, oh, well, let's in one place document the model and the visualizations and the decisions and whatever else. And so there's a connection there. That's really all that comes to mind.
The mute button.
It's cool.
I'd like to ask my own question. I do want to go ahead and ask about how you went spelunking somehow and found that the idea of separation of content and presentation actually can be dated back to the 1960s, if we can say something bold like that. So can you tell us some more about that?
I have the whole path I followed written down somewhere in my notes.
Okay.
It was quite a spelunking. So this was discussed a lot in the early days of HTML, and it turns out it was inherited from SGML, which is a markup language. I don't know if I remember what the SG stands for, but it was a markup language that was the basis for HTML. So HTML was based on SGML. And the people who invented SGML, they had cited this other person, I forget his name, I mentioned in the talk. They had cited him in his talk as being sort of the origin of that idea. And so, again, I have it written down somewhere, but one of the primary authors of SGML, had written on some mailing list somewhere and said this person was, one of the, maybe the originator, or maybe at least one of the earliest originators of the idea.
I guess because I'm so new to technical documentation, and I was also a huge fan of Alicia's Draw the Docs presentation from last year, that a lot of this is just really new to me, but I'm learning today alone that there are all these different libraries for diagramming, all these different libraries for pulling free images and icons. So I'm still wrapping my head around the idea that people have been thinking about this from not just the 1960s, but probably forever. I'm going to ask Aiden's question, which he has pasted into the chat here. He's asking if, do you see a role for piping data from a model into a conventional design tool like Adobe XD or Photoshop?
I don't see why not. It's not something I would think to do. I'm more of a abstraction kind of person, more of a data person. And so, I can use illustration tools, but I do tend to lose patience with them and get frustrated and I end up going down a rabbit hole of just messing with the formatting and getting things to line up and getting distracted, I think, by, visual questions that are not that important. There's some aspects of the visualization that are crucial. I really like to manually position. There are some diagramming tools that will algorithmically and automatically lay out your diagram, just decide for you where to put everything. And there's some value in that, maybe as a starting point, and sometimes so you don't have to think about it. But I feel that the best architecture diagrams have manually placed elements so that somebody is grouping them and placing them in relation to each other to sort of convey in a very subtle way the relationships visually of these different things, the distances between things, that things are closer visually than they're closer in some other ways, not just visually, right? And they're farther apart, groupings of things, that kind of thing. So I'm a little off track here. So I am a big fan. I want to be clear. I am a big fan of intentionally and manually deciding where to put the elements of a diagram, but I personally like to do so out of the context of an illustration tool. So I like to use tools where I can literally write down coordinates, write down a set of coordinates and just feed it into the tool, and the tool will make the image for me.
Yeah, I guess here's where I'm a little bit ignorant, because I haven't really used these Adobe tools that much. And I guess I'm wondering how you would compare them or how they would fit in the context of all the other tools that you've discouraged people to use, which I would agree with. You mentioned Lucidchart, Omnigraphal, Visio. Would you just file the Adobe products in the same category?
So yeah, I wouldn't personally specifically recommend that someone use them. If someone came to me and said, hey, I'm not really using anything particular right now, what would you suggest? I wouldn't suggest those. Mm-hmm. They're illustration tools. But if somebody is using them and loves them and is extremely proficient with them and expert, right, and wants to leverage that skills and expertise, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I don't have an example of doing so, but I could speculate that it would be something like maybe you write some kind of little plugin or tool that lets you bring in all of your elements into some kind of like a picker or a chooser, so you don't have to type in the names manually again, right? They're already there on your canvas, or something like that, right? Or maybe Illustrator can import SVG, I guess, right? So just generate an SVG, generate an illustration, right, as an SVG using that file format, and then you suck it into Illustrator, and then you have a starting point, so you don't have to start from scratch. I don't know if that made any sense, but those are some of the ways. Those are some of the ways I could think maybe you could leverage those tools and leverage that expertise if somebody has it and wants to try that.
Yeah, I think, I guess, like for myself, I'll say again out loud, I don't know if I've actually said this out loud, but it's bewildering that there are so many tools. We've just learned about some more that you've described today. And it's not about the tools, it's about what works for you. And that's, a fairly granular decision at the individual or team level. Cool.
Absolutely.
I'm pulling a question from Lorena. I think she was asking about am I remembering correctly, the Flax maturity model with the different levels in it? She was,
yes.
Yeah, she wants to see some more examples of each one, if you could.
That is a great idea. I don't have any offhand. Yeah, I mean, let's see. I mean, I guess I could show something real quick. Why not? Right?
Yeah, screen share.
Specific. Why don't we get specific? Yeah, I'll just pull something up. Just wait a second for me to pull up the right file.
Yeah.
I'm just opening up the right directory here.
Sure. Also looking at the chat. I think we technically are planning for about 10 minutes for the Q&A, but we do have extra time if people do want to stick around. And our next speaker's presentation begins at 12, if I'm not mistaken. So
can you see my editor that I have open here?
Yeah, and let me think.
The fonts might be really tiny. I don't know, but when I open a document, I can make it much bigger. So I'm going to be careful not to show proprietary information here. I just want to show just sort of that I have these files, So if you look over here on the left, I have a file called ussystemlandscape.yaml, and I've got a file called ussystemlandscape.png and ussystemlandscape.svg. So the YAML is the textual source for a diagram as data. And then we have the sort of generated visualizations from the diagram. So I can't really show too many details, I guess, here. And I want to say this particular example does not separate the model and the visualization. It's close, but not quite. This particular file format that's being used here just does, because we're defining a software system, and then we're saying its position, declaring its position. So there's a mixture of content and presentation here. And this is sort of something I've moved on from, but it's just something I had at hand, an example of defining, this data, the diagram in this case. It's intermingled. In text, this is a YAML file, right? Here's the relationships. Here's some styles, and then if it's generated is a diagram. You run it through a particular tool. Again, not a fantastic example, but it's what I got at hand. I have on a different computer a more modern example of a separate model and visualization.
Nice. I'm looking at some of the follow-up questions from Lorena. She was asking about level 0, level 1, if they correspond to examples like a lucid chart PNG for level 0. And what would be a level 1 or 2?
Well, I actually don't remember, but I can pull it up.
It's your own model. That's okay.
I mean,
just kidding.
I was working on the talk, and I don't know if it's going to be useful, but we'll see.
Why not?
I thought I'd sort of float it and see, maybe it'll be useful. Let's see.
It's fun.
So thank you. So level 0, 1, 2, 3, I have on the right-hand side, manual visualizations. which means it could be a pencil and paper. It could be Lucidchart. It could be using any kind of sort of illustration tool, and you're sort of manually maintaining the diagrams as illustrations separately from the model. And that's what that means, manual visualizations. But yeah, I mean, I maybe got to work on this model a little bit, because the truth is, what I'm doing now is sort of in between level 3 and 4, because I have visuals that are established as text, but not data. The model is data, the visuals are discrete, but they're not data. So I'm not really sure that's even useful. Perhaps I should change that to maybe visuals as text. See, to me, there's a lot of value in having, even if they're not data, right? And the question between data and text is, we could get into that, but I think a lot of us have a feeling for what the difference is, right? Sometimes you can have something that's defined in a textual format. Maybe it's even a specific format, but maybe it's not accessible as data. It's hard to use as data, right? So anyway, you might have, the model in one file as text and the visuals in another file or multiple files as text. And that's huge, because now you can use docs as code. You can collaborate using GitLab or GitHub and pull requests and merge requests and all these diff tools, and you can discuss the changes in real details. And I guess I don't want to necessarily be advocating for multiple things in the context of one talk. I mean, I really wanted to focus on separating models and illustrations. This is more, the important thing here isn't even necessarily a practice, but a mindset, right? When people approach diagramming, I just want them to think of those things and just have it even in the back of their mind. Oh, let me think about the model, the information, a little bit separately from how should we lay this out and how should we represent visually that information.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I'm just gonna add some of my own parting thoughts about the idea of a Flax maturity model, which is that I've been working for a very large company that has a team of engineers who are making pretty good use of software architectural models, and so this talk is personally very helpful to me, because I do feel intimidated about where to start with how to collaborate with them. But I think they have been using draw.io. And so I started to ask questions about how we might consider, I haven't started to ask about going to a different tool, but version control would be great. So we'll figure that out. So we are over time, but if you are open to staying in this Q&A, and if we still have people chatting in here, we'll keep it going. Looks like the next talk begins in 7 minutes for people who would like to start right on time with Ryan's talk. I'm going to rewind a bit. So I think, Avi, you had seen briefly a question from Eric that he had posted to the stage chat. And Eric had asked, let's see, I'm losing a little bit of context for the question, but he had asked, doesn't the visual part of the model add to some of the narrative shorthand? I.e., you don't need to write such and such sends data to so-and-so if you have a box where such and such points to so-and-so.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In the end, you're creating, the end result of all of it is a diagram or a set of diagrams. And those are visual artifacts. It's a visual medium, for sure. And you have to remember that and leverage it, right? Not just sort of work against it or kind of be like, oh, I guess I'm making visuals. No, that's the whole point of it, right? And I didn't have a lot of time in the talk to go into detail about how powerful the medium it is to sort of convey this information visually and spatially, but it can be extremely effective in terms of learning, right? What's the end goal of all of this stuff is for people to learn, right? And documentation in general, it's about learning. So, the question, what's the information? Right? The information that I think you ultimately are wanting people to convey, to learn, is that information about what is there even, what are these different elements that exist, and how are they related to each other? What are the nature of those relationships? Which ones are related to which ones, and what's the nature of those relationships? And that information it's a sort of a static model of a system. Or sometimes it's a system of systems, but one way or another, it's either a big system or a small system, but it's some kind of a system. So in a way, the visualization is an intermediate format, right? You start with the person who has the information, the person or people, and it's in their heads, right? They have this information. Let's just say it's in their heads. Hopefully they have it written down, right? But the point is they have it, and then they want to convey it to someone else, right? They want that other person or people to be able to learn it and learn it well and learn it effectively and efficiently. And so they, how can I package it up, the information, which is the model, more or less, into a visualization in order to convey it into the other person, the audiences, into their brains, right, into their minds. So they can learn it, and it gets uploaded into their mind, and they understand it, and they can use it, right? Not just that it's there, but they can actually use that information. And so the visualization is an intermediate format. And I was talking earlier about how I think it's really, really important, or not important necessarily, but let me say optimal. It's optimal for the authors of the visualization to manually decide what elements go where and how to draw those lines and which direction they go and the groupings and the distances, because there's a lot of subtle information conveyed that you can convey in those spatial relationships between things. Things are grouped together or separate, some things far apart. Sometimes you can even do a directional, there's sort of like a left to right that can imply something or even in a subtle way convey something. So I'm rambling, so stop me. But the conveying information visually, and some of it is really subtle, is super important and super useful, powerful. But I think a lot of the information can be in the model. So for example, the fact that system D talks to system E, that relationship should be in the model, and even the nature of the relationship. Now, when you convert it into a visualization, it's a line. It's a line between the box for system D and the box for system E, and hopefully it's annotated. Hopefully it has a little label on it and says, there's a relationship here, there's a connection, but here you want your visualization to include a legend, a key, and labels and things like that, so that the semantics of those of the notation are useful, right? And they're actually conveying rich detail and rich information. Sorry for the rambling, but that's what came to mind.
Space to an extent is for rambling. I think we will end in a minute. We did have a couple questions. I don't think we have time to really get into from Owen. I think that's in the stage chat, or I don't know. It's in a chat if it's not in the session chat, and hopefully Owen, you don't mind pasting it again, since we can't get to it. It's a question about C4, and then Danashri had a question that perhaps you could also address in the session chat if you have a moment, Avi. Danashri was asking if you could give examples of published articles that use some of the tools that you've described to us, if any come to mind. No pressure.
Yes, no, that's
okay.
fine. I do have some links in the slides, and I'm going to share a PDF later today. Let me put this into this. I put it into the chat for the other sessions. I'll put it into the chat for this session as well.
This chat works.
I'll put it the chat right here. I'm going to put it. Where I'm going to share the slides later today.
Excellent.
As a PDF. There we go.
Thank
so
you.
I'm going to post those slides later today.
Awesome.
Yep. And there are links in it. So there's presenter notes, and in the presenter notes, I've got various links to additional resources and information. And yes, somewhere in here, I definitely have some articles. I would say a lot of great articles have been written by Simon Brown. And I recommend most of his stuff. He's prolific, so he's written in various places. He's given lots of talks. I recommend kind of all of his stuff. It's not always clear where to start. Maybe start with his websites, but honestly, it's all good stuff. Another thought is, there was recently a Slack discussion in the Write the Docs Slack in the channel called Visual Content, where someone asked, are there any good articles about software diagramming? And there are one or two really good posts, really good, one or two or three really good articles that are posted there to that discussion in the Write the Docs Slack in the channel called Visual Content. If you just, hopefully it hasn't expired out. I don't know.
I feel like it.
But I did save it. I saved it.
Okay.
You can save things in Slack, and so they you personally still have access to those messages, even though they can be hard to find. So I don't know. I guess I could repost them. I'll repost them to that channel just in case they've expired out.
Okay, awesome. We're past time, and our next talk has begun. But thanks again for being here and for your awesome talk.
Wow, my pleasure. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Yay.